Heters dunge gyumeda gyuchikbu yimbata. Gyudusu yusin sewar chebata. Wanchugu lui yowa ondu soni chebar. Shena kunjung pongde migewe gyula soba namba shit temba yin osche.
In this way, if with respect to suffering there is a thought that it has no cause, or a single cause, or it exists at the time of the cause and then becomes manifest, or is created by the mind of Ishvara, the wish to eliminate the cause of suffering will not arise. For this purpose, the four aspects such as cause and so on have been taught. And so here with this, the truth of causes is complete. And then, so the first, then there's the truth of cessation, and the first aspect is cessation. It is not eternal, for it is possible to bring its cause to an end.
Sebala gejingi gek topdenta lela tunje machawa sibeshers.
And so then the commentary says it's the appropriated aggregates. So the appropriated aggregates are not a continuum that is eternal, which cannot be brought to an end, because it's possible for its cause, craving, to have a strong opposing factor, and because it is possible for the concomitant causes of karma to not be complete.
Yeah. Tatanda de nyelengi pungbo de chujinche. Takazanga do dicherwa. Dunge demba shebe kabla nyelengi pungbo chujin sunu dunge demba drup. Kunjun demba shebe kadu tela ani nyelengi pungbo dunge demba trube gi gyu khare res keje de she. Tatanda godengi kabla ani nyelengi pungbo de ta gaya yor mare se keje she. Ta nyelengi pungbo de chujinche ani digi gyun gaya yores ta. Gyun gado mirungwa ani mirungwa tenduwa dende mares ko gyun gaya yores. Gyun gaya yobi gyumsen kari resena nyelengi pungbugi gyu kazangazu kunjun dema kalo kari shere seba di zogu sherwa. Den yindu nyelengi pungbu gyu seba la gegengi ge topden dus. Ani nyelengi pungbu drubar chegengi lete la ani tunje masangwa sibi eshers.
So the subject are still the appropriated aggregates, and with the same subject, with the first truth, which is the truth of suffering, the purpose was to establish that the appropriated aggregates are the truth of suffering. Then in the second truth, with the same subject, which is the appropriated aggregates, the purpose was to show how, or show what the causes of these appropriated aggregates are. And now here with the third truth, it's the same subject. And now the question is, are these eternal? And eternal here means, is it something that's going to carry on forever like this? And the response to that is, no, it is not like that. They're not eternal, because they can be brought to an end. And the reason why they can be brought to an end is because the cause of the appropriated aggregates, which during the truth of causes we had seen eventually the main cause or the cause of the aggregates was shown to be craving. So there's two reasons why it's possible for them to be brought to an end. And the first reason is because its cause, craving, has a strong opposing factor. And the second one is because it is possible for the concomitant causes, which are karma, And so the concomitant causes that are karma can be made can come to a state where they are no longer complete. They don't have all the accompanying factors to give rise to the subsequent states.
So
this reason is particularly significant, and this is a reason to prove that liberation exists. And so this reason needs to be considered with a lot more detail.
Tadi ngobu chazan la chigbare tangazo ngobu chazan la chigbare slabi na ta gyud jibu gi namsha shede yo 아니 다 간다 지부치 매버 되거든나 지부치다 소소 지부 간디치 여바 있는 지부디 시버 되거든나 매버 차야지 되거든나 아니 지부디 규 쪼디 무슨 되니 규텔라 뉴지 두메도 다 아니 규텔라 뉴지 요나 아니 지부디 매버스다 소야여스다 매버 소룽제다.
So here, this kind of reasoning is not just limited to liberation, but it's applicable to anything that is produced through causes or anything that is arisen through causes. And the way in which this reasoning proceeds, or the way in which one analyzes anything that arises through causes, is to first identify all the causes that are required to lead to that thing coming about. And then when one has a good idea of what those causes are, try and see if the main cause for that phenomenon or for that effect has an antidote. And if you can find an antidote or something that harms or opposes that a cause, then it's possible to bring that cause to a state where then the effect does not arise. So when it's possible to find an antidote to a cause, it's possible for the effect that would have arisen from that cause to be brought to an end or prevent it from arising entirely.
다 디기 초주 주베다 저수도기 잡아 주비니 낭네 아니 다 초주 주베디 내가 충분해 당보.
And so to prove this reason, there needs to be the property of the subject and the forward pervasion. And amongst these two, the first one is the property of the subject. So sorry, it's not the concomitant causes that are karma, the concomitant causes required for karma.
다 어디로 와 간스나 레레 코르비 풍부 주고 와 레레 코르비 풍부 주고 여바 인디 레레 튕긴 거와 코르비 풍부 주베레 겐 거로 겐디 세바로 세바라 기징 인연보 여바 차윤디 아니 레들 튕긴 마상 차로.
So here what it means by the concomitant causes required for karma is that the cause, even though there might be karma, but the concomitant cause that is required to activate or for that karma to ripen is craving, and so it is possible for the concomitant causes required for karma, here referring to craving, to be brought to an end or to not be complete.
다디 촉주 주변라 딘시 수르니기 나네 수르 당보디 쪼레 디 유세발라 기징이 게 도된도 우세 쪼레.
So of the two parts of the property of the subject, which are, it's possible for its cause craving to have a strong opposing factor, and the second one, which is it's possible for the concomitant cause required for karma to not be complete. The first part is more important, or it's the more significant one, which is that its cause craving has a strong opposing factor.
So that the dinzi tangbo trubela, dinzi yusur tangbo so indi tichuburwa. So that the trubela, and seba de nyelingi pumbu guin bata, and seba la gejingi gek top de yoba, ta ni semetupudwa.
And so here, if to prove this first part, which is that it's possible for its cause to have a strong opposing factor, two things need to be shown here. One, the first one that needs to be shown is that craving is the cause of the appropriated aggregates. And the second one that needs to be shown is that such a cause, which is craving, can have a strong opposing factor.
That di gu nyelengi pungbu tiki gu zo di seba yinba di kazangazo kunjung dembagi ani gu do kunjung kabla gume da takbe gu kaane ani rabje da kengi namba kabdo zela ani ta chakwa di chakwa namba sum rimba shin sheche kanda chakwa sumbu di ani pungbu gu zo yinba kazangazo chik sheba ondi ki kowa chasana yaguchi cha simbu chikorda.
So for the first part, which is that its cause, or the cause of the aggregates, which here is being mentioned as craving, to establish that this is the cause of the aggregates, what we had seen earlier during the truth of causes, where it spoke of how craving is the cause that leads to the appropriation of the aggregates, or to taking on new aggregates. And the way that this was discussed was by showing how there are 3 levels of attachment, which is attachment to the self, then further on, so that 3 step way in which attachment arises, which were all forms of craving, and how those lead then to taking on new aggregates. This has to be clear. So to be able to establish the property of the subject of the proof for liberation, that earlier aspect or that earlier part of how craving is the cause for taking birth, from as explained in the truth of causes, has to be clear, has already to be been established.
So that seba do cheje kini thunye gi seba itini cheje dewa thumde gi seba dini ya chen yundu dala chabe seba dala chabe chakwa skeje di she yundu ani dadu tawa marikba yena ani seba dinju chazan yungdi ya dadu tawa marikba mena do roba di yundu seba doji gi gyu chabar chendi marik dadu tawa marikba yimba dangjin di yimba do cheje trup chawache.
And then above having understood that craving is a cause for the aggregates, taking that again, that process where there is craving to states of birth, which is preceded by craving for pleasant feelings and craving for wanting to be separated from unpleasant feelings, which then eventually then stems from or comes from attachment to the self. After having understood this, then the other thing that's also important to understand or have established already over here for this to become the property of the subject is that as long as there is the notion of the self or there is ignorance that perceives the self, there will be attachment to the self, which will then lead to these 3 kinds of attachments that arise. And when there is no longer the view of the self, then these 3 forms of craving will cease. So have further established that even though craving is the cause of the aggregates, the root of craving is grounded in a view of the self.
So that dadu tawa marikba di seba di thamje gi yungsa gi zawa do seba di doji gi gyu cheba je yimba dus trup chabe jela ani lingge gi lola dadu jin yundu da lola chardan gajab lola chardan ya gu ji lola shawache ani dunge de me namba shebe khadola ton dami dubu jibo di dus gongba sheje dami be kowa di da di mindu seche ta tha che sabashi.
So then after having understood that this ignorance that sees a self or that perceives a self or conceives of a self is the cause or is the indispensable cause of craving, at that point when that has been clearly understood, then recognizing how the self appears to this ignorance, so then having a clear idea of the way in which the self appears, which is having a good idea of what the object of negation is. And then when one has a clear idea of the object of negation, then use the reasoning that is presented in the truth of suffering, which is empty and selfless, to show how such a self does not exist. And so for it to become the property of the subject, even this has to have already been established. All of this has to have been done.
Dadu dawa marikba di chinji lo yimba trub yung chinji lo yimba trub gurwa so the truba la tene ani dungi gi phungbu gi gyu seba thela gejeng gi nyimbo top din du usta meba suji gi nyimbo top din du us.
So then after having understood that there is no self, then one therefore can understand that the view of the self is a wrong perception or a mistaken wrong perception. And then when one understands that that is a mistaken perception, then that mind that is a mistaken perception, because one has understood that the object that it is thinking of or conceiving of, which is the self, does not exist, because one has established selflessness, then one will know that the mind, which is this notion of the self or self-grasping, is a mistaken mind because its object does not exist, because actually there is no self. And when all of this comes together, then one understands that the cause of craving has a strong opposing factor.
So that danji mevar soye yube seba ge gyu zo danji lo tuk du seba ge zawa de danji lo tuk du 당진 매버 수에 요버 툭사디 당진 친주로글로 이마디 간다 당진이 다도 셴바나시 모빈이줄 다 매버디기 토네 당진 친주로글로 이마 손자 고 세룽레스 이게지 디르다.
So the reason why here it says it has a strong opposing factor, or why it's saying if it has a strong opposing factor, it can be brought to an end, is because self-grasping is realized to be removable or can be brought to an end because it is a wrong mind. And because it is a wrong mind, it has an opposing factor, or it has an antidote that can be applied. And through the application of this antidote, then the continuum of the aggregates can be brought to an end, or they are suitable to be brought to an end.
다 로양 타고 있나? 신 매버 수에 요 말와. 로디기 신 순충에 요 말에. 답변나 매도 짐비 로디 로 매도 짐비 똑과디 매도 짐만나신 쿠파기디 매도 임부인디 거기 신 순충에 요 말. 신인들 리빅이 네버 땅에요 말. 리빅이 네버 카인게다 수게요 말와.
So if a mind is not mistaken, I mean here, okay, so just to be very clear, we call it wrong, right? Wrong consciousness, the ones that don't have existence as their objects. So if a mind is not a wrong mind, then you cannot refute its object of engagement, or you cannot refute that its object of engagement exists. For example, the mind that sees this flower, if it's not a wrong mind or not a wrong consciousness, that means that you can't disprove or refute what it engages in, what it perceives.
다 디메도 짐빌로 디까고나 탑신이마도 요 말에. 탑시치가래 야메나 메도디 뚝 메워스요. 야메나 메도디 메다 잡시 가리는 메도디 메워스요 샤이직. 야메나 메도디 일을 지금 메시지 일을 쳐봐 까지. 메도디 일을 맞춰봐시도 까지 돼야 탑시 디니마도 셴바 메도 짐 똑고 끼리다.
So if a flower exists, then the mind that is perceiving a flower, especially the conceptual mind that perceives a flower, because that cannot be done away with by realizing that its object is non-existent, there's only two things you can do. Well, the first thing is one can cut the flower, burn the flower, whatever, or find one way to destroy the flower. And the other thing is, so that's dealing with the thing, the flower itself. And the other alternative is to not bring the flower to mind. So not focus on it or not pay attention on it. There's no third option.
다 강사 리치기 메도 짐비 똑바디기 강의지 수용용도 탑시 당보디 표시시에 메도디 메라로 잡 메도디 고로 카두 고로 메워 수액이 표준시니 탑란 당고 표시시기로 봐. 탑란 당고 표시시기를 돼. 탑란 당고 표시시에디 카두 메도디 메워 수나야 ngar medo jimbe tokwa ge namba sha de tunji di yile yang ge kho de dwa yile yang ge kho de ne di kangi so di gro medo jimbe tokwa ta ga ke di gro.
So in such situations there are people who will act primarily to try and do away with the object, so try and find a way to get rid of it, make it stop existing or bring it to an end, so cut it, burn it, whatever they might do. But even though they may be able to destroy the object, which is in this case the flower, the mind that has already perceived the object will continue to have an appearance, or a meaning generality of this object will keep appearing. So the mind can then keep thinking or ruminating or reflecting and bringing to mind this image of a flower again and again.
So the parrena pejimindo tinji yile sha de na kangi che di do.
Even if you cut a photograph of someone, it doesn't help because you can keep thinking of them in your mind.
So the tadishidi 탑신 이버도 표시시고 다 탑신 이버 가래래 다 고 일을 제바 가샤나 일을 제바 고로 일을 제되나 다동강이 고짐에 똑바 레디기 여바인데 아니 가서 지연 일을 미시베 검색해서 어디 탑람도 표시시해 아니 검고르다.
And so because things can keep appearing and that can still create difficulty, another alternative that is often used is to not bring them to mind. So then there are those meditative states that one cultivates, which is where one brings nothing to mind. So one actively disengages from all forms of perception.
다 지연 일을 미시베 검샤바이나 아니 디기 카두 메도즘에 똑바디 가두기 고 팽고르다.
And when you do this, where you actively disengage, so those are those meditative states of voidness, where you just cultivate a state of voidness, where you bring nothing to mind. In that moment, because the mind that is thinking of a pot or of a flower in this case doesn't come up, there is an immediate benefit to it.
That di gomyala rigbo gomare, sherab gomare, rigbo tangoe keyo marta. Method yile cheba kaya lola method yile cheba kaya la ani method la ta rigbo mo tang ni samo mo tang ni jegom khayin chego mare. Koron khadu gom koron gi technique di shen sona ndigam de sha ba ina method na ka.
So to cultivate such a state, there's no reason that's required, or there's no reasoning that's required. There is no need to cultivate one's wisdom or refine one's wisdom. Instead, if one learns the techniques that are there to bring nothing to mind, or to empty the mind of all content, of all thought, if one learns those techniques, then without needing to cultivate wisdom, without needing to use any reasoning or reflecting on anything, one can just cultivate these states where there's nothing anymore that appears to the mind. Because this is a much easier solution, most people tend to prefer such a state or cultivate such a meditation. They gravitate towards this one. So now when you go to most centers which teach shamatha or vipassana, the techniques that they seem to be teaching are predominantly meditative states where you don't bring anything to mind, or you disengage from thought. If you cultivate this kind of mind, then you'll also end up not being able to do anything or use something like a flower in any way. So why you can't use a flower is because your starting point was recognizing that as long as you have any engagement with the flower or it comes to mind, it disturbs you, and so the wish to engage in it or one's ability to engage in it is compromised after one has seen that if it comes to mind, it's difficult. And so then the only solution that one develops or one has is to actively not bring it to mind. But then again, how much can you sustain that state of not bringing things to mind?
So tan nangbegi sangi chumdendigi tadum nang kharsungolana meto yile che ka go mares. Meto yile cheba di kangi sugu yo mares. Meto de la ta yunde ngaran so gi tatang norba ji yor digi kangi sugu yores. Tatang no di gywa tang shana meto yile chena kiran kangi khayin chegi mares. Ani meto mutuni pheji shera res odi sungu yor.
So in the Buddha's teachings, the way the Buddha identifies it or describes it is, the Buddha says there's nothing wrong with bringing things to mind. There's no difficulty that arises from seeing or perceiving a flower. There is something in the perception of a flower that we currently have that is mistaken. So there's an element of error in the way we perceive a flower. And that way that we perceive a flower, so that incorrect way of perceiving the flower, if that can be done away with, then just perceiving a flower is not going to be leading to any difficulty anymore. And so there is a method where you can do that, which is why you can continue using a flower, engaging in it, having it, but it doesn't have to lead to difficulty.
Tas meto de la tatang norwaji gi kangi sugi mewa she meto koron yile cheba tagarang ya kangi ngoni sugi yona an demba den yare ta meto yile cheba de kana ma do thabshi yo mare ine di mayin bi proof khari yorla na meto tagarang la minyi gi ta yonde chi gi tatang norwadi gi kangi chagi yori chi gi tatang ma norwadi gi kola kangi thigi yo mare.
And so were this not true, and were it just the perception of a flower itself that were problematic, then there is no other option other than disengaging from a flower or not bringing it to mind. But the fact that that's not the case, and it's not just a perception of a flower, but a mistaken way in which it's perceived, that is the problem, is evident from the fact that two different people can perceive the same thing, and with one's way of perceiving it which is mistaken, that thing creates problems, whereas another person who does not perceive it in that same way will not have the same resultant difficulties that arise from that perception.
다디 ngaranzu nyongwana yer ngaranzu susu nyongwana lo la ya susu gi kangsa chigla tatang chigi kabla kangsa dil gaw chediya tatang chigi kabla kangsa dil magawa chediya 그래서 소자다 kangsa di yila cheba chikbugi di yungo yo marta kangsa di yila cheba chikbugi ngazola gawa da migawa di kigi yo mare kola tatang shenbaji gi ton ta yungdi kola gaw chediya tatang shenbaji gi ton ta yungdi kola magawa chediya 소자 수수기 따단지기 토네 아니 파게디 ngo보디 강네 ngo보텔랑 가주기다 차단게 줘야지 마도 ngo보디 거로 일을 제바정기 차단기 기기메와
And so this, to a very large degree, we have a very clear idea of this already, because in our own experience we do know that when we have the very same person that we see or we perceive, there is one way of perceiving them which leads one to have a lot of attachment. There is another way of perceiving that leads to a lot of irritation or frustration, and so aversion to the same person. And so it's not just this perception of the person, but there's something that accompanies that perception that can make it a cause for attachment, and there's something that accompanies the perception of a person that then makes it a cause for aversion. And it's not the person themselves, or it's not the perception of a person themselves that leads to this attachment and aversion. So this fact that it's not the perception of things per se, but it is the way in which they are perceived, or there's a manner of perception here that is leading to all of these problems, is something that we can tell.
다디 ngazo di 체리백의 리서치기도 와 디나시 ngazo 소소야 디강라 리서치나 약고요.
So the same way that scientists are currently researching this fact, it's also important and it's helpful if we also can research such a thing.
ngobo khanda khaina야 tela gada magasedi susogi tadanchigi toni yungudube ngobo koran yila chebadi yugudu seje ngazo susu gyundeni tonang teje chebana waina yaw.
So if we can like frequently or regularly try and find an answer to the question about whether it's the perception of things itself that makes us like them or not like them, or is it a certain feature that accompanies them, if you will, or is there a way in which they are perceived? Is there a manner of perception that makes us like them and dislike them? Or is it the thing itself, the perception of the thing itself, that leads to these two? So one obvious experience that we have is when one reflects on the faults of something, we feel like we dislike it. And then when we think about its positive traits, then we start to like it. That we know this, this is easy. This doesn't therefore need any kind of reasoning or analysis. We know this. The reason why this needs no further reflection is because the nature of liking or disliking things is when the way they're perceived is accompanied with seeing them as faulty or seeing them as positive.
디 따당디다 미디 코랑게 나야 니부디 퉁구디 퉁구민도 디 퉁기 매바이나 디 퉁기 매바이나 아니 미디 코랑 일을 쳐봐 점기 차단 끼기 매와 그래서 미디 코랑을 통나를 유와 가르두고도 균쟁 가리는 캐봐요 맞다 균쟁 야가 촌에 따기 이나다 누가 촌에 따기 이나다 가리 따바이네 캐봐요 균쟁을 가리 손을 디기래 이네 균쟁 데다 사모땅체 카두텔라 아니 미디 롤 샤베 카두텔라 롤 샤윤디 미디기 소소기 르 따당디 컨디스도 아니 지 딘데기 캐바 가야 마치베 내가 미기 토나디 컨디스도 어디 심주 채워봐.
So because seeing them with positive qualities, we naturally see that we like and when they don't, we dislike them. Leaving that, this doesn't need any further reasoning. But what is kind of helpful to try and do is when someone appears or they look or we see their positive traits, the way in which we perceive these traits and the way that those traits manifest themselves to us, is that the same? So we're trying to see, while they appear with all of these positive qualities and we start liking them, is there a way in which we look at them, or is there some aspect of our perception that is beyond and above the way in which those qualities or that person manifests themselves to us? And the same is applicable for when we focus on their faults. So when we look at their faults, is it just the appearance of their faults, or is there something additional that our perception is doing in that moment which leads us to disliking them? And so the point here is, there's different scenarios you can do it in. One where you're seeing those qualities, and then also in moments when you don't see them as positive or negative. And is there some sort of common thread in all of these three moments where the way in which we perceive is adding something beyond what that thing manifests itself with? And so if you find an inconsistency in the way that thing appears in and of itself and the way in which we perceive it, then you can come to try and have some idea of how the perception of the thing itself is not necessarily detrimental or faulty, but there is something in the perception that is being added to it that is problematic.
So that day nango sangi bi karish shegor selana nango sangi bi tadumni so the chadam magi bi negabla ngobu di jimi negab gi togbegi ngobu tegarang ngobu tela jindan teda chakba kebe negab gi chadan kebe negab gi ani ngobu di jimbi lo ni barula kheba sheda dos the chima di gi kap tela ni ngobu di gi ngobu pet khoran number daw yimba chigla delo mixegi khorangi lögi chig söje rodaje ani ngobuchi ta söde ba digi kange sogu yores di indi ta medo de shigu mares medo di yile chiba kago mare medo di meba soye bejin chego mare medo tela ani chadan gewe nega gi ngadu roda shajugi namba jero di ngobeni zule meba di shesuna ani chadan gi lodi ka ani medo yile chiba di ka mogo bache ani medo di beji cheyo bache yungres odi songu yorda.
So what the Buddha said, or what therefore later Buddhists say, is that when you see something, there is the perception of the thing, and then there is a mode of apprehension. So I think we call it mode of apprehension, or a mode of apprehension. There is the thing that we perceive, and so then in a moment where you perceive something or you apprehend something, and then in another moment where you apprehend it, where the mind that apprehends it is a state of attachment, or the mind that apprehends it is a state of aversion, what the Buddhists say is that there is a difference in the way in which you apprehend it in these two states. So when the apprehension is not happening through attachment and aversion, or the mode of apprehension is not that of attachment and aversion, then there is a difference in the way in which you apprehend things. And the difference seems to suggest that when you apprehend them through attachment and aversion, there is an addition or there is a superimposition that the mind does or makes that leads to attachment and aversion arise, but this superimposition is something that the mind itself is creating. It doesn't necessarily correspond to the thing itself. And so then what the Buddhist says, if you can clearly identify what this superimposition is, or what this addition in the mode of apprehension is when it turns into attachment and aversion, then you can separate between the flower and the superimposition on the flower that leads to attachment and aversion, and then you don't need to destroy the flower to prevent all of these resultant afflicted states from arising. But if you can pierce at the mode in which it is apprehended when there is this addition, so if you can destroy that superimposition, then you can still continue to perceive the flower, you can continue to use the flower, and you will not have these resultant afflictant states that come out of that perception.
That talam dende mindawa ni yude talam chima di kisi ngobinesu ta tanda nangbe shungni sheba talam di ngobinesu yimba yina nganzol di yasarwa
So if this Buddhist way of describing it is actually true, then amongst the various options that we have to try and get rid of the afflicted states, the Buddhist one seems like a good alternative because it's allowing you to engage with things, perceive things, but simultaneously not be harmed by them or not be affected by them. So that would probably be a more helpful way to have them engage in them.
그래서 탑람 당고 등고윤수도 차게 여바이나 딱깔리 쇼레도 답 지야스 땅아 니코나 신지 대대고식으로 받지야 일람시 대고기로 일레치나 강에 태용으로.
Whereas if the first one was more accurate, then it's kind of hard because then the only real alternative that you have is not bringing anything to mind. So cultivating states where nothing comes to mind then is really the only solution.
다 디니기 예와디 좀 된디기 도나로 송요래 도나로라 아니 신이기 람디기 케랑라 톨로 토기 마레스 아니 녜버도 하동 곰고레스 김쟁 가르치는 시대 아니 디카도델 도나로라 아니 베 로주주 송요 로주 가르 송스나 아니 나르 창송지 아니 다 미과 일레치나 강이 티기도 디임 송자 아니 코랑게다 미과디 까지 제일을 미쳐고 곰체 대용도 아니 신의 줍제다 디코랑 갈라 하제 론도 로코랑 일을 미쳐봐 내가 대지 대용도 드는 코랑 따름고 쇼차 당송 따름고 쇼차 데리 체제 또 로몽고 디간 덴디션 대버레스 한 젤라 냠샤딜레 당레르와 냠샤딜 당용도 따름고 쇼차디도 코랑게 따도도 나로 지지기 창선이 야마 디체되어와 한 지지기 창선디 통용도 미국 샤워인도 랑자 콘도게레스 콘도게버지 다디 당송 학주세죠 당송 학주세죠 소자다 단도 도디기 시그널로라 학주기니 딘진공바신스 소자다 신의기 람잠기 계란기 강에 세투고 말레스 기지 세투고 요바이나 당송 학주를 강에 티고 말와스 이나 당송 학주기 띵인지 덴디 주름부 고브레데 타마 띵인지 지엔 일메제버데 파 식제니 젤미바 통용데 랑자 콘도게소와스 손전 디기 람디게 그거 말에 손전 셰르코 다메도 셰르코레스다 어디 디가도 로기도 송여.
So the fact that this is not sufficient, this by this, it means just cultivating this kind of, I don't know, voidness, then it starts to sound like emptiness, nothing, it's nothingness, bringing nothing to mind. Cultivating this kind of state, not being sufficient, is even mentioned in the sutras by the Buddha, where the Buddha mentions of one rishi, and this rishi had noticed that rishi is like a saint or like a practitioner. But while they had seen that they had noticed that they were getting affected by seeing things or perceiving things, they cultivated shamatha or calm abiding. And because they had cultivated shamatha or they had cultivated calm abiding, when they noticed that their mind was affected when they came in contact with things, they cultivated this state of not perceiving anything. And because they had already generated shamatha, they remained in this meditative state for an extremely long period of time. And the period of time that this rishi remained in this state for so long was so long that the hair grew out really long. And when the hair grew out really long, because it was all long and matted, these little mice, they came and they started making nests in the hair. And so then when this rishi woke later from their concentration and they saw these mice running around in their hair, they immediately got very angry. And so the Buddha says, see, even if you've attained, so there's this rishi in Tibetan is called Hakju. And so in this sutra he says, even though this saint had attained states of samadhi, when they came out of it, they immediately got angry again. And therefore cultivating samadhi itself is not sufficient. You need to cultivate wisdom. And the wisdom that you need to cultivate is the wisdom of selflessness.
다 미과 메도디 까야 말에 텔라 따당 노로지 디카고레스디 다디 제주당 아니 디메비 줌젠텔라 디메비 줌젠텔라 직보 코론탄 까야르 마도 메도 까야케요 말와 메도 시게케요 말와 디간 넘버 따당 디 기승고베니 주이나 콜 직보 카르니 직보디 삼당고디 아니 뭐 제곰세디 레버다
So if the flower itself is not to be refuted because it exists, and the flower is not to be destroyed, but there is an additional component of superimposition which then leads to a specific mode of apprehension that then leads to attachment and aversion, then what has to be destroyed or what has to be broken is the way in which the superimposition perceives its object. So one has to destroy the superimposition. And the only way to destroy the superimposition is to first identify what it is, and then later on use reasoning or use reasons to dismantle or break the way in which people have this mistaken apprehension. There is no other way to be able to do away with it. And that's why in the Buddhist tradition you find so much emphasis laid on analytical meditation or vipassana, because that's essential to be able to break the superimposition.
소소기 따당 노르죠 디기 신유디 셰럽디기 까 아니 신이기 째지기 곰디기 조체인디 실라 송드제베 nenjo스 오 디기 따 녀몽 좀제 아니 간조라 따 조바토기 여다.
So wisdom, the role that wisdom has is to analyze and break the mistaken perception that these superimpositions have made, and samadhi or calm abiding has a role of making the mind rest on that realization single-pointedly. And so the union of vipassana and shamatha, the yoga which is called the union of vipassana and shamatha, is then the tool that is used to remove or cleanse the afflictions and the stains of the afflictions, the seeds of the afflictions. And so that's how the path is described to be cultivated.
Ta di indu dala chakwa di meba soya yubi gyumzin dala chakwa di dokchi gi gyu chebar chendi dangzin di resha dangzin gi yul da di ngobi nisu remendu us di rigbe pa ka che di rigbe ka yungdu dangzin chinji lo yinba songzang ani kogi ngobi nisu tongba yina lo di ka zhugu res pena takwa di ngobi nisu lo dul ma yinba songzang chisamgi duldu shenba yinaya dul ma yinba di hakowe ni modela takwa dulzigi lo dodu res petina shi res odi sungi yor.
And so because attachment to the self is the problem, but the cause of attachment to the self is self-grasping, when one understands that self-grasping is wrong because the self does not exist or the object it engages in does not exist, it has an incoherent mode of apprehension or an inaccurate mode of apprehension, then by refuting the self, one comes to know that self-grasping is a wrong consciousness. And when one comes to know that it is a wrong consciousness, then that leads to the certainty that by cultivating that view of selflessness, you can do away with this mistaken notion of the self. And the example that's given is, for instance, even though you might perceive a rope to be a snake, the day that you realize that a rope is not a snake, from that moment onwards, you have refuted the notion or the belief that that rope was a snake.
Tire, so da du sindu, da du shije ani tanda di pungbu gi gyu seba la gejin gi gek nyimbo top dan demba dus da di trup ani khang la gejin gi gek top den yona ani pajo gi di se di chuni res di karere pena 차주 펠나 장무 시도야. 장화 펠나 차와 시도에 그 춘이래. 가르치나나 코란이 파도 트고요 말이야. 맞았다. 두라갑랑 아주 장여와 개와텔라 모겔세야직당 아니 흰지미네게스 흰지도 네마도 봐. 또 뭐보 코란게 춘이래. 흰지도 파도 양도 네마도 찌기찌라 만여버 체제. 소자 저 펠나 장화 시도야. 장화 시나 장화 펠나 저 시도야. 가다 코란이 파주 만유버신 대통 말와 디나신 나도 짐바 대다 나 매버도 비 셰럽니보디 파주 찌기질로 뇌디기로 봐 파주 찌기질로 뇌데 가시나 군이 흰지미네게 세야 다 코란이 파주 찌기질로 뇌기 요바 연데 가리디기 아니 가리디 매버 찍 매버 차기를 찍 대기랬어 다 간디 매바 차그래라나 다음에도 비셔럽디 되기래 당진디 매바 차그래 가시나 당진디기 미과 다디 오비니줄레 매바 인디 콜레 잡된 세마 요마레스 코시루 그레스 아니 다음에도 비셔럽디 다음 매바 또 와나시 다음 매바 오빌레 네바 송자 코무튼 되기레스 어디 디시고다.
So when one realizes that self-grasping is wrong, then one has understood the property of the subject, which is that the cause of the aggregates, which is craving, has the cause of that, which is self-grasping, has a strong antidote. And so then if the cause has an antidote, then the nature is that it is going to prevent or it is going to remove self-grasping. And if it removes self-grasping, then all the resultant states that come out of it. So then one can prove the forward pervasion. And the fact that it is the nature of something to be incompatible with another one is something that we already did in Dudra, where we looked at contradictory things as things that are directly contradictory, and then there are things that are contradictory because they don't abide together. For instance, the more heat there is, it is the nature of heat to ensure that, or to make it so that cold does not continue. And then if cold increases, that's the nature of the cold, is so to make it so that the heat will not carry on. So when you have the wisdom or the mind that realizes that there is no self, its nature is to ensure that this other mind, which is self-grasping, does not arise. And if that does not arise, then you can bring an end to, or the resultant states will not arise. So an increase in self, in the wisdom of selflessness, its nature is to make self-grasping naturally diminish. Now amongst these two, when these two are present, which one is the one that in the long run will remain, and which is the one that will eventually fizzle out or die out? Of these two, it is the wisdom of selflessness that remains and self-grasping that dies out, because self-grasping is engaging in an object that does not exist. So self-grasping does not have any kind of valid justification for what it perceives, what it believes, and what it thinks, what it does. Whereas the wisdom of selflessness, because what it engages in is actually real, that's how things really are, that of these two, when cultivated, it's the wisdom of selflessness that is engaging in something that is real and is consistent with reality, that will be able to remain, and the other one will therefore go out, or the other one will not be able to remain or reside any longer.
아니 심중 rig 망고 셰 대나로라 심중 녀 따위 rig 따와 마인비 녀몬쟁기 rig 아니 땅가서 녀몬델라 자위 녀몬델라 마셰 인도 따와도 따밍이 녀몬스 아니 딘주 장년체 아니 디네네 녀녀니 슈세게 녀몬게 남샤 망고 지마 숭구도 와 냠샤 망고 지마 송제 아니 녀몬 대다기 미과 가르레 진당 가르레 딘조 마셰 단 녀몬 대다기 첼레 가르레스나 첼레 심규 마시버치야 셈범무기고 쇠야 아니 룽하기 차와 쪽바 튀유야 강이 쇠디 코 첼레 로든족이 녀몽든족이 첼레 차디었다 다 녀몽든족이 첼레 디인데 다디 첼레 딩가족 디 첼레 코 녀몽든족이 첼레 디레 디 제주고요래 다 셈범무기와 대당 룽하기 차와 마룽바 튀유에 디 아주 시구고요로다 아주 셈범기부 대구고요래 룽하기 쪼바 마룽모도 시구고요래 디인디 디 제쪽인디 로 간디지 심중 간디지 간조를 모두 규바이나 심중 마시버치기도 룽하게 차와 쪽고 튕기도 어디 심중도 문진 체제 든조라 녀몽스지 밍다르다.
So when you look at Buddhist literature, you find this description of like they divide mental states. And when they divide mental states, you'll find that mental states are divided into categories that are associated with a view and those that are not associated with any view. Then there are mental states, and then in the description of those mental states that are associated with a view, there are mental states that are described based on what their object is and based on how they apprehend their object. And then those mental states that have a view, you find this description of what their object is and how they apprehend that object. And then those that don't have a view, there are another. So when these two are clubbed together, there is one group of them that has the function of. So there's the object, how it apprehends its object, and then its function. And if the function that they have is to disturb one's mind, then the result of this function is that it immediately disturbs one's mind, and after it disturbs one's mind, it leads to physical and verbal actions that arise from this disturbed mental state. And all of these are then further classified into what you find in the divisions of the afflictions. So all of these mental functions that make the mind uneasy are all clubbed under the category of afflictions, which are then divided into those that are associated with the view and those that are not. And you'll find this description about the view where it describes its object and its mode of apprehension, and then the function that it has of all of them commonly is to disrupt one's mental well-being and result in physical and verbal actions that are also detrimental to one's happiness and peace. So these then, when you further classify them in the text, you'll find them divided as the 6 root afflictions and the 20 secondary afflictions. And these are all described as afflictions because their function is to disturb the mind and then lead to speaking and behaving in ways that are not favorable for one's own happiness. And so they need to be done away with, or one needs to remove them for one's well-being, which is why they're classified as the afflictions.
Semba kibu deogo yo segi samlo miyu yo degen. Ali tarba tamji semba tarungu gongba shetun yakshorwa. Tarba tamji semba gongba shematu na ya kanda mata yinba. Sagyu tungju chuna yago yonada menada. Kuryu khandiji le nenada manada kanda semba kibu deogo du segi. Semba kibu sogo du segi miyu dende yo dengeji yinba yina. Ani semma kibur so kengi tanda shesha yogi simjung nyemo gi rigdi tushtuwa. Dilori nang songsha yore denzu chasang chi shibsabu chene lobjon che de kechumbu ber.
So if anyone feels or wants to be calm or happy and doesn't want a disturbed mental state, whether one is concerned with liberation or not, of course, if one is concerned with liberation or that's the final goal, then it's more meaningful. But even if that is not the final aim or not the final goal, and one is concerned with mental well-being or mental peace, this distinction or division in lorik that you find of these different mental states is something that's quite helpful to be familiar with and have an understanding of.
Ta simjung nyemong denzu chasang lobjon shi chabu che ne simjung nyemong ri denzu chasang ngazu gyula keni kete gorta. Kete ge yoba yinde ani di kerin shindo ani susu gi nyonga la karche. Simgyu mashiwa, simgyu magiwa chadang, ani lunga gi choba mashiwa, tuandang junzo la du susu nyamnyunga du seje, ratrabache.
So then, while you study it in the text and you find this explanation of afflicted states, that description of afflicted states that are there in the text is something that is constantly happening to us already. And so, while you identify and you can understand the description that you find in the text, at the same time it's very helpful to identify them when they start happening inside us. So when one is experiencing those afflicted states, then it's very helpful to try and see how that description that one had seen in the text actually pertains to something that one is experiencing in that very moment, and then equally importantly, to try and see or identify how those states lead to our mind being disturbed, or how they make one's mind not peaceful, how they inhibit one's well-being. And so this repeated effort of trying to see in oneself these states that are always already predominant, but identify them and see how they hamper one's peace and well-being is very important.
다 디 온도 교르등이 님은 된소 라야고치 트여제 다 디까고도 세게 삼루지 코바 이나다 삼루지 코바 이나 단 나고 상기 위흉 시에게 냠랭기 시탕부도 고수요다.
So if this happens and one is able to identify this, then if that leads to the wish to do away with these afflicted states, or having recognized these afflicted states and how they affect our mental well-being, if the thought comes up or the wish to remove them arises, then that's the first real foundation or basis for engaging in Buddhist practice.
다 디래. 소저 다 디인디 다 딘디기 녀몽디 시에기 삼루지 코바 인디 간라 다코 콜레다 탑시 최고로 녀몽도 매버스에 탑시 최고로 와. 다 탑시 가리레 슬라비인디 아니 나고 상기 비숑니 녀몽디 차상 신주로 로레 디인디 거기 진단디 모비니스 마레스. 소자 거기 진단디 모비니스 마레스. 진단디 모비니스 진단기 유디 모비니스 마잉바 땡라 팝시 아니 모비니스 강통 로디 깨바이나 군이 아니 린지미네기 당기 진당미투 뭐니디 린지미네기 차기레스 다 나고 상기베기 냠부 땡당데 디스다.
So if one generates the wish to pacify or remove these afflictions, then the way it's explained in Buddhist texts of how to do it, or the way it's explained by the Buddha on how this is done, is that the Buddha describes all of these states that disturb one's mind as wrong minds. They're all described as wrong consciousnesses, which means that the way that they engage in their objects are all inaccurate. And so the way in which they perceive their object is all incorrect, because the object that they perceive doesn't exist. And so by cultivating the correct view, which understands that these minds are engaging in mistaken, non-existent objects, so cultivating this wisdom, then the wisdom that realizes that these afflicted states don't have any real objects that they engage in, or the objects that they engage in are not real, they don't exist. This wisdom and this affliction, these afflictions, they can't go together because they do not abide together. They're contradictory in the sense that they do not abide together, which is that understanding that came from Dudra. And so the way in which antidotes act upon the afflictions, in the way the Buddha described it and the way it's described in Buddhist literature, is that these antidotes, they do not allow for, or they do away with the afflictions, because these two do not abide together.
미세 가라스 냠냠냠 수수기 초안나로라 아니 로직 문진시 단다버도 수수기 미세 나로라 로직 문진시제 딜로디기 갈강이 수기도스 딜로디 문도 교바 있는 감마시 세모마기 부처기도스 세지 수수기 문진톱제 아니 딘디기 로디기 겐다 다 로디 친주로 로디 진당의 유든지 제바체제 아니 로디 친주로 로데샤 티기 겐다 딘디지 두스 세제 아니 겐다기 냠부때야 딘디지 사모코제 아니 겐다 임바 시제 아니 티기 냠부때야 딘디지 중요바 이나 아니 계랑이 미제나라 냠레 고축 사버다.
So if in the course of one's life one has discovered one state, even one mental state that is harming oneself, and so one identifies a mental state that harms oneself, that harms me, and then after having identified the state that harms me, if I check and see whether the way in which this state of mind, this mental state of mind, perceives its object or engages in its object is accurate, is consistent, is real or not, and I have cultivated a realization that what it engages in is not real or does not exist. And so I have not only realized a mental state that I identified as harming me, but I've also identified that its way of thinking or engaging in its object is wrong, and I have cultivated a mind that is contradictory in the way in which it perceives its object. And so I have cultivated such a state after such a realization. If I have done this, so if anyone has done this even once, that's for the first time when one has actually done what is called here as what is called practice. So actual Buddhist practice, if this has happened, then this is actually what Buddhist practice is.
친주로 임바 라마트바 체제 아니 디기 겐다디 통마토바 체 이내야 디카에기 묘진 체대바다 디 마게기 탑시 체디기 요바이나 안치다 냠랭기 게제 셰초고르데 나와상기비 냠랭기다 시디 탄다 차.
Whereas if one has identified a mental state that is harming us, and in trying to find a solution to it, one cultivates various other states without realizing that that earlier mental state is wrong or it is incorrect in the way it perceives its object. And so without cultivating a mind that realizes that that mental state is wrong, if one engages in other practices to try and reduce that or try and do away with it, that may be classified as practice. But until one realizes that that mental state is wrong, that doesn't qualify technically. It's not a question of qualification. That's not real Buddhist practice.
Pena 미지기 강의 속이요나 미지기 니마 딱봐 신용도 세지 강의 속이요나 코냠도 커도 맞은 것이 커도 맡아버치 콜레바다 유에제 파트 투투들이 제대바이나 미디 코냠도 증기요 말 미디 코냠도 탑기요 말이 유탑치기요 봐 디나신 제제 아니 니몽직 문진 제제 디기 강의 속이요 하고 이는 디기 님보 여바 마통 디기 친주로 그런 친주로 로이모 마시 디기 겐다 님보디 마통 아니 코 문도 규르마주 얘기 탑시 얘기 셴바간로 도스 디삼로다나 로디기기 요선데 디삼로마다는 셴바지가 삼로단 도시나 그윤 되데비서로지를 마도 코님도 탑기요 말이 어디시는 게 냠len 낭백이 냠는 고마도 고추고요 말에서 디르데.
So for instance, if you have someone who comes in kind of fights every day or is confrontational every day and you don't confront them, but instead of confronting them you find ways to kind of like hide or avoid them, then what you've done is essentially you've avoided the problem. Similarly, if you have these mental states that keep arising and realizing that they're problematic, you don't confront them by realizing that they're wrong and trying to see whether the way they think and the way they believe things to be is accurate or not, and realizing that they are wrong, it's like the same thing, you're not confronting them. You might try and find other techniques and other methods, one can try and do all sorts of other things to try and reduce their intensity or not make them happen or prevent them from arising. And all of those, kind of like with the example before, those are all methods to avoid them. But you haven't really confronted that or taken it, tackled it head on, which is why I was saying, until you do that, you haven't really confronted it, tackled it, you haven't understood that there is an antidote to it. You've just found ways to avoid it. And that's why I said it's not technically still Buddhist practice at that point.
Ta nyamle ina tada shede ngonegi nyamle chetandi yemba ina midun chodigi nuba chungtang nuba nöch korwa ta tangi lawana shin midela khadu jingba ina suchiglana phajigla khadu jingba ina khadu khate chawa ina 아니 미디 누바디 짜고 오르다 맞아 다 지딩기 빼나 현재 누바 짜고 오르다 이에 대바이나 콜라 카데게 짜기면 그 누발 간 짜기요 말와 오페디나 신체제 간다 도 체제 미과 샴발라 삼로 땅야다 샴바간 두 고코르 대바이나 디기 코랑이 로 디기 누바 간 짜기요 말에 카두 될 이어버리 마도 카두 누바게 짜기요 말와 다 냠렌세나 간디시 고고요르세디 오디 sembo simgu magi wo sogengi lotigi niboma chaenge chkorda niboma chae chkorda so niba chae de gadu chagerelana khorangi genda takta dillebaino niba chagere pena changwe niba di gadu chagere chawadi chagere tangi lawnashi 소소 장외 뉴버디 차와기 마도 셴바 장이 마르와 디나시 로디기 진주로기 로디기 뉴버디 가리기 짜기를 코기 겐데 로디기 짜기를 마도 셴바 강기전 짜기 마르 어디 나뭐 상기 붙다.
So when the word practice is used, a sign that it is practice or that practice, what one is doing is effectively practice, is when what one does has the ability to deflate or remove the power of the mental states that are problematic, so the afflictions. And when we're talking about removing the intensity or removing the power of the afflictions, it's like when you're a normal, ordinary example that we use, which is confronting somebody, is if someone keeps being aggressive or keeps attacking one, then if you do all sorts of different ways, you find different techniques or different ways to kind of not confront them. Whatever you're doing, all those methods that you use haven't really reduced the intensity of their aggression. Their aggression remains the same. Whereas if you confront them and you argue with them, or you fight with them, this is an ordinary example, if you fight with them, that has the ability to reduce the intensity of their aggression or do away with their aggression entirely. Similarly, if the practice that one does is not reducing the intensity or not reducing the afflictions, then it's kind of like that. You're avoiding them and you might be able to not have them for a while, but their intensity and their power remains the same. And the only way that one can reduce their intensity and their power is realizing that they are wrong. And so if you realize that they are wrong and they have non-existent objects that they think about by cultivating minds that are directly contradictory in the way they perceive, there is nothing else that you can do that can actually reduce the intensity of the afflictions. And so it's kind of like if you feel very cold, the only thing that can reduce the intensity of the cold is heat. And the same applies the other way around. If it's heat, then the only thing that can reduce that intensity is the cold. Similarly, the only thing that can reduce the intensity of certain mental states that are harmful is by realizing that they are wrong mental states. That's why the purpose of practice, or a sign of practice working, is when the mental states, the intensity reduces. That's the entire purpose of practice. And so unless that's happening, one is not really practicing.
강에 태사 심규마기버스 차에 강에 수여사 디 아니 디레샤스 탄다버도 심규직 문진시에지 교와단이 문진치에바다 디 교와단이 삼로 탄다버 디 코르메나 아니 냠린치에기 시코라요 말다.
And then further still, if one has not even had the thought or one has not identified a mental state that we find is harmful to us, then there is really no kind of nothing to go on. There's nothing that practice has anything to go on anymore. So there's no base at all for practicing unless one feels that there's something wrong and one has identified what that is.
다 딘디 메베 토네 안가조 하곰 조그레 딘디 메베 토네 ngathang chogre dende mebe thone lagang dun choba phe chogre chome phe chogre ro kora jab chogre khala masane ngajo de dende yung chogre ani dende mene dangi lawana shin chia yel mi jebe dende gom chogre 상마 제 chogre de di 상마 jigdenbagi jigdenba koran so dodana shi sheba ina dende che de badela chöchigi nyamnin chigi yosege ming ta shar ma do So
without having this understanding, which is just first identifying it and then cultivating a mind that is directly contradictory, without having this, without having understood this and without practicing this, one can visualize deities, one can accumulate mantras, one can go to temples and light incense and offer lamps. One can do all sorts of other practices. And all of these things that we do, they may be seen from outside as practicing. And so normally in the world, without having this realization or without having this understanding and this purpose, all these other things that we do, even meditating and cultivating these states of absorption which are free of all thought, if they're not supported by all of this, all these activities that we do, which is these external activities or even our mental trainings that we can do from outside. In normal speaking, in normal ordinary parlance, we say this is practice. But seen from the point of view of actually doing something which is trying to counter a mistaken view and cultivate a genuine antidote, all of these things don't qualify as practice. They are not actual practice.
양면나 고 타니두스 표시시에제. 와 가서 디도와 지당기 practice 라야 되는 계제 직당 지당이 냠len세 계제 직당 심 두텁기 냠len세지 고 림번이 치에제. 와 다단다 인지식이 야고도 마인드 트레이닝 세. sim dudab gi nyamling gi rimbati dil laba yina ani ta thangi chediya di so sim nanglo la target khaya me deba sim nanglo sim jung jing mun jin target sim che dela khate cha gi samlo khaya me ba thone thangi che mangbu chediya di jidang lunga gi gejor so ro cha chede go ro da ta di gi sim ju dila semba dila gwa khaya thip gi marta.
So in English, the word mind training is good. So what we can do is you can separate it and say there's practice, which is kind of ordinary practice, and then there's practice, which is mind training. But mind training has a very specific target. The purpose of mind training is to pacify one's mind. And because it has a very specific target, which is having identified something, and then now cultivating an antidote to that in this way that we just said, if this is not happening, then whatever else one might be doing could be like virtuous, physical, verbal, mental virtue. But it's not actually training the mind, it's not pacifying one's mind, it's not removing any of the obstructions. And so that doesn't really qualify as practice in the sense of it actually working on one's mind. All these things one does, they don't touch, they don't have the ability to impact one's mind at all.
다단다 디도아 맞아 지당이 트레이닝 나로 티처 트레이닝 세도 여러와다 양단다 디가르 멍미 트레이닝 때인데 여러와다 소소다 단다 딩고는 멍미 트레이닝 때 요소로시다 소소기 갑대 가리 디 가르친 세고요 고마세는 거기 술 가르치기를 트레이닝 때기도 디소로시고다.
So the kind of like there's different kinds, we say teacher training or there's also military training. The kind of training that we're talking about over here as practice is almost like military training or army training, where you identify the enemy, you identify the methods required to destroy that enemy, and then you actively cultivate those techniques. So that's the kind of training that's needed for it to actually become practice that can change and pacify one's mind.
예, 마음이 트레이닝 체제죠. 마원에 두디 배치체 마당 세 마당에 용거다. 감다도 드리고 용거야 디도시 용초로.
And some people who do a lot of army training, but when it really comes to a actual scenario of war, they get scared and they can't do anything. That also is possible. That can also happen.
다 디레 송자다 남부상기비기 님부 체단이 디레 고랑이 겐다카리 님부 체다다 님부 체단이 니유다 냠내 체단이 심규 머시워 칭게 레레 문진 체제 디기 겐다카리 카리도 두 체제 아니 고메 직체 다 예박 미든초 셈모지고 송이 망부 휴지도데 디 창막이 짜와 가르레샤서 짜와 직 문진 톱시 니 레레레기 님부 때문에 거치 짜와디기 카둥 님부 때문에 안디 가르에 다 탑론이 송이었다.
So So when one speaks of Buddhist practice, there's two ways that it's kind of listed, two kinds. One is where you identify each mental state that is problematic. So you identify each individual afflicted mental state and you cultivate an antidote that is directly contradictory to that individual afflicted state. So that's one way to go about it. Another way that it's described is to not try and find each afflicted state and cultivate its own individual cause, but try and identify the root of all of these afflicted states, what they all have in common and where they're all coming from. And then once one has clearly identified what that root is, then try and find a way to counter that root or work directly on that root.
소자다 디인디 단다 디케란조 인지민지로 랑게 버셔와 예베 세모마기로 송이 자와 로카리 이네 지 문진투 버체 deep meba suya ki samlo nyamne che ki shi go zu gu yore se ki shi di re se chi ta deep pong ye de ba ke yong de deep meba suya ki de ba ke yong ki nyamne che ki dumba di le re es ta di gi genda gi nyembo ma thong ki photo di chinju lo yimo ma thong ki phardo nyembo shen ten de ba di ani nangbe thumu ma yi nyamne che da ma re es di inji mi ji lo la ye ba chi 다 디기 친주로 디 친주로 이뭐 셰지 디기 ngo비니스 카리 뭐 겐다기 님보디 통제 아니 디 통네 아니 디 고메지 고츠바이나 나와상기 비추기 냠니 고마디 고츠바레스 디 하고 와지 그래서 다 디니니 제제제기 님보 하고나 야 제제제기 님보 때메고 봐 탐지기 짜와직도스 탐지기 짜와직도 디메바 쇠샤나 아니 군사상마 메와 차르고도 세지 아니 짜와고나 크둥 님보 때야지 고츠소나
So please keep this in mind. The starting point is to identify mental states that are problematic and generate a wish to do away with them or the wish to remove them. That's the basis for practice. If one doesn't have then there is no basis for practice. Then, when one sees them and one has the wish to remove them, so when one identifies states that are detrimental and are harmful to one's mind, and one wishes to remove them, then one has the wish to practice. Then one will have the wish to practice. But until one finds that this mental state is wrong, and one identifies exactly the antidote or the opposing mental state that can remove this mental state after having identified it to be a wrong mental state, and wrong in the sense that its object doesn't exist, till then one is not really doing practice. But when one identifies the mental state that is directly wrong to this one, that is directly contradictory with the mental state that's harming us, and one starts to cultivate that mental state, then one is engaging in uniquely Buddhist practice. That is what is actually called Buddhist practice. If one goes one step further still, and without doing this on each individual state that is harming us, one finds the root of all of them and identifies this process on all of those. So one identifies the root of all of them, identifies that it's wrong, generates the wish to be freed from it, discovers the antidote, that is realizing it is wrong because its object doesn't exist, and starts cultivating that, then that is known as practice that leads to liberation. So before that it's Buddhist practice. When you identify the root and are working on that, then that becomes Buddhist practice that leads to liberation.
But dindi ting sablo de gya chejung mewa kanda dindi chi gozu yuna dawa chik nanglo la semlo gyuwa matemna misi parta.
So if this has been identified and you're doing it, irrespective of how deep and profound or how profound your understanding might be, if this has been identified and one has done this even for 1 month, one stays at it even for 1 month, it's impossible that it will not have an impact on your mind. It's not possible.
Ta dindi nyembo tseje genda tseje nyamlen che matuna ya nyamlen dugu dindi gozu matuna ya genda thon na gozu tu mena ya dungye yongsa di kangye songe di dirisha asene ngunjin toba khorang chigula ya sembala gasu shuyor.
And then if one is not able to, like let's say one has identified this problem, one has identified the antidote, one knows that that problem is wrong, but one doesn't have the time or is unable to practice that, in the sense one is unable to meditate on it, but one has all this understanding and this realization, but one is unable to implement it. Even just that much is extremely potent, because when one realizes that the source of one's suffering is not coming from outside, but is coming from self-grasping, then that itself leads to an enormous state of, like, that the resultant state is very joyous or very happy.
So
the most of us currently are unable to also identify this.
kadambe lama chik di sonrwa ni sangi ki songrab dene mangbu tösam chen slobjon chen is ta mangbu shu chen de dom di khari rasla na nyokta songen de pura dirishas chilol min dirishas di ha go songs.
So there's one Kadampa Lama who says, I have read all this vast corpus of treatises of the Buddha and all of the commentaries. At the end of it all, kind of the real heart or the real kernel that I have, my takeaway from all of this is that the source of all problems is here, it's not there.
Sonza di lama digi, korang lama chik ta lama tenga do gorwa. Ta lama tenga do diga la ngajo amji tenga do na naza laye gorda. Naza laye mena ane mengang la change na doctor ki khari negi do la na hago ma sons la na doctor kharchu doctor this go negi ya.
So when this Kadampa Lama, he went to his teacher to receive teachings. It's kind of like going to the doctor, but you have to know what you want. If you land up at the hospital without knowing without knowing that you're sick, and the doctor says, "Why are you here?" and you have nothing to say, it's a little weird.
Go na yudiwe, kangma na yudiwe, thogo na yudiwe, jikeje do ti inde, hago masons laba ina doctor test. Doctor go na yugo suguro.
So the doctor says, "Is your head hurting? Is your stomach hurting? Is your chest hurting? Are your legs hurting?" And to each one you keep saying, "I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know." You and the doctor ends up with their head ends up hurting.
So amji za dona chikta laye gorata. Khari nagi chik laye chik do gorata. Mare.
So isn't it the case that if you go to a doctor, you have to have something that's not okay? Otherwise, why are you going there?
Dina shi ngazo so lama ta dro yundi, lama tenga dro yundi, ngala kangi chi tus. Di naza di khari yu di lao gorta, laye chik gorta.
Similarly, if one goes to one's Lama, you're going there, you have to have something that you want to fix. Like something has to be wrong with you. You have to have something inside you that's not okay, which needs fixing, and then you go. Otherwise, why do you go?
So da kadambe lama digi sungrab chasang go cheche, kangen sunge, magibu sunge, pura tuksa di imba, naza di imba ko ratchen yundi, korangi lama di za chenche, tab sunge pura dirisha, tab di meba suegi damgaji nauro na se di shudwa.
So this Kadampa Lama, when he went to his Lama, he said, after having read all the texts and having understood their meaning, having understood that the problem is here, the problem is inside and not outside, when he went to his Lama, he said, "Please give me instructions on how to remove the problem from inside."
So korangi ngala dangjin tuyegi dambaji nauro na se di shuber.
So what he requested was for instructions to be able to tame one's self-grasping.
Tene lame di damba nache, damba di tobi yundi, damba di toba da nyamni chegyur da shini, kapde shini kyajur da damba di toba korangi gada sheche, da yine shini gyoba mindus, karshina na ngala dangjin meba suyegi damga di raa songs, da nga shini gyoba mindus, kodi lama di.
So this Lama then at that point when he received this instruction, he was so overjoyed that even without engaging in practice, which is all to be done, like he still had to engage in the whole practice. But just having received this instruction on how to remove self-grasping, he said, now even if I die, I have no regret because I have finally received the instruction on how to remove self-grasping. So if I die, I have no regret.
So
the words he said were, having received instructions to remove self-grasping, even if I die, I have no regret.
So the kajing nga zo keje chi chung ba. Chue che go res la de nga gyuwa tang gu yus, khari gyuwa tang gu yus na dine dine chi yus se chi ngunji chi go res kajing nga zo keje chi churop chung ba.
So we discussed this a few recently, where if I feel I want to practice or I'm interested in practice, I have to at least start feeling that there's something that I need changed or there's something that I want to change about me.
가정이 결혼설 장가지 해주고 가리가리 유었던 거 순간을 디두래 장가지 해주고 그래서 가정 쉬임 봐.
So the other day I mentioned to you that one should have a list, like one should be able to list out all the things that I want to remove or fix.
가정이 쉬니 결혼설 근데 장가지에 중소해서.
Did you have an occasion to come up with such a list?
중에는 또 어디다.
So if you did, that's great.
다 가리가리 기와 땅고 유메 나로는 욕다 송에디 문진 투바 있나 나자디 문진 투브레 다디 기와 디직 탑시 가르쳐야 그래서 깨제티가 로이 그런 기와 땅에 듬바디 요시 다딜라디 계랑이 나자 뭐트레 나자디 쥐에기 듬바 요다 다 냠네 쥐에기 듬바 요다 다 디미디 수국이 내당 가리 요는 메나다 상계기다 아주 낭비치니 깨제시나다 미디시라 짜춤다.
So if you've done this, why it's helpful is because you've identified the disease or the problem. And having identified the problem, you now have the wish to remove it. And with this wish to remove it, now when you will go or you will listen or you will ask and seek for any counsel and advice, it's a very pointed, targeted counsel to an issue that you have identified. So now you have the wish to practice. Even if you cannot practice, this itself is considered so precious that according to the way that such people who have this wish are described in the text, so by the Buddha, is that such people who have this attitude now are very precious and rare. So there's this term which is called Cheducha Vidulja, which is such a person has become an like they are now recipients to receive the teachings of the Buddha. So the teachings of the Buddha are made for such a disposition, for such a person. They are now recipients for the teachings. And so such a person, whenever they read anything or they think about anything or they engage in any of these activities of reflection or listening or reading, they'll have enormous joy. Naturally, they feel very happy. The reason why they feel happy is because whenever they look at the text or they're reading, they're looking for antidotes. And each antidote that they find leads to a resultant state of happiness. Whereas it's also possible to study all the texts without this kind of motivation or without this drive. And so such a person can study all of them, teach all of them, explain all of them, be very eloquent with respect to all of them. But because they don't have that initial drive, they will not be able to identify what is acting as an antidote for what. And so that practical part of it will be unknown to them. So there's many such people who, even for instance, when we study at the Institute in MacLeod, it's a 16-year program. There's many people who can actually study for very long periods, for 16 years and even more, and have the same mind, like have a completely unchanged mind. And there's also many people who study like this for many years, and they conclude that this was of no use to them.
So that dinde lamgelle yungde di kharita tengorslana tambo korangi kulon karike yore mi target khande simyor di chaza shiden de mewa thone dos lobjon sheba yinde ani lobjon sheyu di phema song sambar shemba dangin nashin du samotan ke yena da shung gangzang da pa sha shu din nalo ni chashi jig nyembu chungjun jig raba yena dagarang digas phengirlana semna gyobam yashi yor.
So when people say this, it's a clear sign of, or it indicates that the way they have approached it, the purpose they were there for, the motivation that they had before engaging in this study, you can identify or you can find out what that was. Whereas if someone has the intention that we mentioned, forget about all the studies, even if in this entire long period that they have devoted of their life to this, even if they find one tiny antidote or they find one tiny solution to their problem, just that is enough. Forget the whole corpus, but just that is so satisfying and so gratifying that They have a completely different approach to the studies and everything.
다 딘디기 꿀론다 시든 창마 단기 시험을 시든데 여대바 얘나 심주산 차게 말다. ngazo bebeki tambejerowa 땡주 마리바이나 땡주의 랑에기 베전식이르와 소자다 녜몽디 토마메바는 검데 요래 고톱 첨보 요래 야된 세마메는 요 쿰디 첨보 쇼 요바인데 코 랍상 카테 죽첨보 짜마도나야 디기 샹와도 쇼바이나야 야 우즈겐의 랑에기 베전식 양 쇼르바이나 우즈겐의 랑 딱한다 또 세제 로디그다.
Also someone who has this kind of intention, and when they start engaging in this, they don't get discouraged. There's a proverb in Tibetan which says, if you fall 10 times, you get up 10 times, which means when they've realized that these afflictions have been going on from beginningless time, there's no immediate victory that's going to come. And so even if you are trying and you are working at it, and you fall down and you fall prey to them, you get up and then you again try it, and then you get up and you again try it without ever getting discouraged, because you're acutely aware of how much strength they have and how right now we're still in a very nascent phase. And so even though you might not get immediate results, such a person, they don't get discouraged, they keep at it. You'll find that they keep at it with great joy and with great enthusiasm.
다 덴데 갑라니 신이 셈낭로라 땅알 서포트 고도스 로 emotion support go jig support go leisure ni ta lame gi support go do sangye gi support go do yidam da khando da chögyong da phagbi gindyin da jinso gi support go do se ge kyamdo gi lo di tu syungor supporting.
And so then when you're in with this kind of mentality, then at that point when you're working towards this, then you feel like you need support, and the support that you need, that then makes you rely on a lama, the Buddha, a community, the dakinis, the dharmapalas, the protectors, the deities. And so that is then something that you start to feel or seek refuge in, all of these things, as a result of having engaged in that practice.
So that those nyamnenche dende sozoge ngal robo go do robo cherona seje dende so tabyongdi ta lama da ngazu nguzu sheje yorde sangye de chaju semba da yidam hazo de mangbo ji nguzu sheje yo marde sozo semding na so do tabyongdi milum chunje nanglo la ya ani ta chema de choje a keran simshu ma cha mutun rosho nga support yeda se ta chema do de yungdeji 딘데 ngazu milam chida milam yabuji tangba ina joginik sana suini kibu yugudo gagido ta keran milam ji nanglo la keran mutun roshi keran lamga normindo ani keran support nga yoda se ge yidam da khando dinde chema chunji chungba ina sangi de nik se inde semno draw shenda min ra jer yang gersim shu pa.
So when then one with this kind of wish to find support or seek refuge, then one makes supplications or one does prayers and supplications, then of all of these people, of the Buddhas and the deities, the ones who we can have directly meet as one's guru, but all of these others are not there, like we don't personally meet them. But when one makes supplications to them out of this concern, out of this genuine concern, then when you start receiving signs and dreams, like for instance, if you have a good dream, you're happy, but if you start receiving a sign from either the deity or the lama or the Buddhas or one's dakinis or the protector saying, I'm here, I'm there, I'm supporting you, don't worry, keep at it. Then when you wake up the next morning, you have a state of, the joy that you experience is something that was unknown before. It's unprecedented.